So now I have the pleasure of introducing today's amazing speakers. Becky Ospina is an experienced human resources executive with over 20 years of experience in a global leadership role. She's passionate about delivering a world-class employee experience through attracting, developing, and retaining the best talent for the business. She enjoys designing and implementing people practices that improve the employee experience, organizational capability, and stakeholder satisfaction, all to grow the business and make it a best place to work. Alexandria Warren. Alexandria leads Velocity Global Solutions consulting and enablement teams, tying best-in-class HCM tech with practical global HR practices. Before she served as VP of Customer Experience and Delivery, overseeing teams responsible for driving employer of record excellence and guiding customers in their global expansion goals. With 12 plus years of experience in the private, startup, and nonprofit sectors, Alexandria applies deep expertise in international expansion, talent acquisition, and human resources. Sanjita Samal is dedicated to providing exceptional service to global mobility clients, managing complexities across countries. Sanjita's deep industry knowledge drives value and fosters strong, long-term partnerships with clients. He also serves as the Americas lead for alternative work arrangements at Vialto. So without further delay, it gives me great honor to introduce today's speakers. Becky, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Clarissa. On behalf of the panel, we are excited to be here today. We are going to kick this session off with a poll. So we'd like to understand, what is your current organization's international presence? This will help us better answer questions today. So please take a moment to put in, where are you currently at with international presence? Okay, and we'll show those results. Currently only operate in the US. Okay, looking to expand internationally. One or more legal entities outside the US, here to learn more, actively expanding. Great, so we have a very good mix of folks attending the seminar today. Thank you so much. I feel like that kind of diversity brings about the best conversations. And today we're going to take a much deeper dive into global expansion with a group of fantastic speakers and unique perspectives. So excited to be here with Sanjita and Alex. Thank you. So the first question is really about why. Why do companies expand internationally? And so when we look at things like talent availability, market entry, cost efficiencies, the customer base, time zones, customer support, cultivating that competitive advantage and mitigating risk and diversification, perhaps closer access to the end user, brings up a lot of interesting challenges. Um, the most important thing is, what is HR's role as leadership at the strategic table? And so what I always think about is understanding deeply and completely the why. What is driving the business need to expand globally? Getting in front of key stakeholders. You might have multiple reasons why. Your CEO might be thinking one thing, your CFO something else, your chief operating officer yet a third reason. And all of those are important. So as an HR leader, knowing what is the definition of success for all of your key stakeholders. You're going to be faced with many decision trees along the way. And as you're making decisions, we're going to talk about entity and EOR today, but understanding what is driving is really going to help you navigate all of the decisions that you're going to face along the way. and being that key partner that's being able to deliver results. So I think, as we, embark on this journey, is getting in front of the why. What is driving the business decision? And so the first decision, entity or EOR. So with that, Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think amazing to see the poll. I saw around 9% of you are using an employer of record solution. So certainly want to make sure that we define and ground what that is heading into the discussion, since a little more nuanced for some of you. So an employer of record helps you scale global hiring faster. It's actually a third-party organization that becomes the full legal employer of your workforce and assumes all employer-related legal responsibilities and tasks on behalf of your company. You can still maintain and control the day operations of your global workforce, but without all of the headaches and worrying about how to do this compliantly in that jurisdiction. Our human capital management platform allows companies to access and leverage our global corporate infrastructure, which is the key tie to this entity comparison in over 185 countries. And so we're not only supporting that global expansion, but also providing that strategic guidance around hiring practices, compliant payroll practices, how to be competitive in market. So really taking that off of your plate. When we think about the ideal use cases, and Becky noted a few of these, this actually originally was really the brainchild from high tech looking for new market expansion faster. So on average, you can enter with an employer of record, we say kind of 80% faster than setting up a local entity cross-border. It also, post-COVID, has been a huge area with human capital solutions for cost-efficient talent, as well as where we're seeing talent scarcity in different jurisdictions. And so you're able to expand that footprint in that search to get the right talent in seat. We also see, I'm sure everyone has been in the news on contractor misclassification. There's been some big concerns over the past few years around contractors being misclassified. So converting those contractors over, as well as in instances of merger and acquisition in cross-border scenarios, and entity dissolution, where peripheral markets for a company no longer are serving them, or the complexity associated with them are actually hindering the business. So a number of use cases that support across the corporate life cycle, and we'll dive into some of those specifics. Sanjeet, I'd love to hand it over to you to speak to the entity setup component.
Thank you so much, Alex, and hello, everybody. So let's turn our focus to one of the key considerations in global expansion. So Alex talked about EOR, but setting up a legal entity in a new country is a key part of decision-making when it comes to global expansion. And one of the things that I believe, and I always suggest corporates and clients, is there is no good or bad strategy. The best strategy is really the one that aligns with your goals, your timelines, and your risk tolerance. So in today's environment, there are multiple ways, like we discussed about, to enter a new market, EOR, legal entity. But what does entity setup really mean? So at its core, as you probably know, it's about giving your business a registered presence in a new country, which could be in the form of a subsidiary, a branch office, or a permanent establishment. And it comes with the ability to hire employees directly under your company's name, open local bank accounts, sign contracts as your legal entity, and build local presence under your own brand identity. The approach is really that it gives you greater control, but with greater control comes greater responsibility. So I'm asked a question most often is, when is the right time to consider setting up a legal entity? And the considerations can basically be categorized under four main categories. The first is long-term commitment. Do you anticipate staying in the market for a foreseeable future? Then having a legal entity provides a more permanent structure. Growth and scale is a second consideration. Are you planning to move beyond just a few employees? In that case, a direct employment structure might be more beneficial for you. The third category, and an important category, is local regulatory requirements. Sometimes in certain industries or jurisdiction, you may be required by law to have a legal entity in order to sign contracts, hire talents, or even offer specific benefits. And the last and one of the key consideration for a lot of different corporates is employer brand. So if companies are really invested in a particular market or a country, a legal entity can offer a strong brand credibility in the eyes of both talent that you want to hire and your clients. That said, entity setup is not without trade-offs, right? So it can involve upfront investment, lead time, and ongoing administrative efforts. The key here is to recognize that not one size fits all. So entity setup is one of the several strategic tools that's available to you, and it's not neat, like it. I won't say it's better or worse. It's just a different way of aligning to your specific business needs. So as you think about your global growth strategy, the right question isn't should we set up an entity, but it's rather at what stage of your expansion, what structure best supports your goals, timeline, and your risk profile. The other question to ask is, which is why I'll hand it over to Becky, is what role does HR play in shaping the decision? So to wrap it up, I'll now hand it over to Becky, who will walk us through how HR leader evaluates both the models.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sanjita. So when we opened up this discussion, we talked about HR's role at the strategic table, and it really is evaluating and making sure you're asking a lot of the right questions around why. Certainly cost is a big part of the conversation, but what drives all of those costs in both models, there's certainly different commercial aspects available. And when you're looking at short, medium, and long term, what marries up with the long term solution? So understanding how those play a role in which countries you're looking at and for which particular services, products, depending on your industry. The other thing that you really need to think about is when you're thinking about long-term culture perspectives and maybe some of the intangibles, how do those marry up well with the business around culture and engagement? And what that looks like for you as an organization within your industry, and just being really honest about what that means and the impact on your company, dispersed workforce, remote. When you think about ESG initiatives and certainly sustainability, those are all factors. AI and technology are big disruptors. How does that impact your industry? And what are you doing strategically to get ahead of it? So there's a lot of different factors that go into this. And so when Sanjita says one size doesn't fit all, that is absolutely true. And you as an HR professional have the benefit of observing all the areas of the organization and aligning your model and strategy with what fits you as a business. You know your leaders, you know what the long-term aspect is. And so really lean into that and leverage that as you think about the global strategy and moving forward. So with that, Alex, I'll turn it over you to lead the next section.
Thank you so much, Becky and Sanjita. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I want to double click actually on really when we talk about global risk, what we mean, because this can manifest very differently depending on what your company size is, where you're at within your growth cycle, as well as what your specific industry vertical is and how your risk profile and risk tolerance is going to evolve. So we're going to go ahead and launch our second poll question, which is which global expansion risk would you be concerned about, just so we can help frame up our next section. I'll give you a couple minutes here. We'll give a couple more moments. All right. Perfect. Well, the top two are Sanjita and I's favorite topics. So compliance with local labor laws and regulations and managing international payroll and tax. These are huge areas. Love that we're seeing also geopolitical uncertainty, entity maintenance, because they're all intimately intertwined. When we think about an employer of record, and one of the core benefits of these kind of 2/3 main topics around compliance. How do I stay abreast of an employment regulatory system that's constantly changing, taxes that are changing on a global footprint? This is going to be one of the keystone areas where particularly a full service employer of record is going to be a very strong tool. An employer of record actually handles all of those key compliance areas on behalf of you as a company within their own entity ecosystem. So payroll, tax, labor laws. As an example, Velocity Global's legal team, we joke, although it's quite literal, is the size of a Fortune 500 company's legal team. Why? Well, because we have a global footprint where we are managing thousands of supported employees in jurisdictions that are all on different employment systems, employment cycles, payroll cycles. So that's where you're going to see that that compliance piece really taken care of on your behalf. So it's not something that you actually have to manage or monitor internally. Now, again, there's going to be some trade-offs here in circumstances, for example, where you are importing or exporting, right? Or where you are looking to bid on government contracts. While there's pros from an employment and payroll perspective, your legal operation and market may still actually require you to have a physical footprint on the ground. And so that's going to be a key area that you're going to want to look at. Additionally, there's going to be that flexibility. Sanjita mentioned this earlier on what is your long-term goal in short, mid, long-term goal in market. If you have a long-term initiative within a jurisdiction to really treat it as a core hub location, an entity footprint may actually be better than an employer of record. Whereas if you have more short, mid, and even some long-term but more peripheral market operations, an employer of record could give you some more flexibility without some of that added administrative headache or burden of making sure that you're operating compliantly. Sanjita, I'll pass it to you on the key compliance and regulatory steps.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. So that brings me to a segue to what I mentioned around control. So we talked about local entity and bringing greater control. And I mentioned with greater control comes greater responsibility. But one big part that comes with it is greater complexity. So the key is understanding what are you signing up for when you set up local entity. And we have talked about what entity setup really means and when it really makes sense. But what we will do right now is really look at the practical side. So specifically the compliance cost and operational considerations, and what does it really mean to an organization when they look forward to setting up or when they consider setting up an entity in a local jurisdiction. And, sometimes it's not just registering a business name or hiring local employees. It just is a set of structured regulatory and compliance at the onset as well as the part of the ongoing process that limits the decision in terms of moving forward to an entity. So it could be registering with local tax and government authorities, opening bank accounts in the country, You'll also have to consider appointing local directors or legal representatives in countries. Alex touched upon payroll and benefits, and that's kind of one of the biggest concerns because we hear a lot about payroll audits in different countries these days. Employment contracts, employment law plays a big part in specifically in certain continents of the world. And also one of the most important is, the focus around labor privacy and the social security laws. So each jurisdiction, as you'll see, or, you probably know, has specific requirements and timelines. And, your goal on setting up an entity or expanding can vary significantly depending on those timelines associated with setting up an entity. So in some countries, it can take a few weeks. In some countries, it may take several months, especially when there is regulatory approvals or certain notary processes that are involved. So one of the things that we often talk about when we sit with the corporates around expansion is how do you weigh in the cost and benefits? So on the plus side of setting up an entity, you do gain full control over operations, your employment terms, and how you brand yourself in the market. You can contract directly with clients and vendors, which is sometimes the key for a lot of different companies while they're expanding. And especially as you scale, entity setup can be more cost effective for you. But what's really important is, or beneficial from an entity setup perspective, is the regulatory and credibility standpoint. Sometimes it just is strengthened by having a local entity in the country. On the other hand, though, there is a higher upfront legal advisory and administrative cost associated with legal entities. So that's very important to know. I already talked about go-live timelines that might get delayed depending on which country you're setting up. But one of the things that's an eye-opener, and as we speak, I'm supporting a client with that, is winding down an entity if you have to, and if your venture doesn't go as planned, right? So that could be complex and time-consuming, particularly in certain countries where strict deregistration requirements are in place. Coming back to setting up an entity, one of the countries where, like India, for example, is a high growth market. However, you'll see there are multiple layers of, steps in the process in setting up an entity. At a high level, you'll need to get approvals from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. You will need to register with GST. You'll need to get a PAN number for tax purposes. And sometimes you also have to have exchange control regulations in place through RBI. So the timelines in this case can stretch from a few months, from a few weeks to even a few months or even longer, right? So it could really vary depending on the entity and the industry. Because of these trade-offs, many companies really adopt a phase approach. So they might just start testing the market through an EOR arrangement. And once they have validated the market opportunity or tipping point, in terms of what the headcounts would be or the regulatory needs are, they transition to a more formal entity. So the most important point here is whether you lead with an EOR or go straight into an entity setup, the decision should be deliberate and informed. And to bring it all together, I'll now hand it over to Becky, who will dive into what it really means for the HR leaders.
Great, thank you. I think you both have really highlighted the complexity of global expansion and having the right partners. And from an HR leader perspective, regardless of which option is best for your organization, you are going to need the right partners on the ground, advising, consulting, and resources that you can tap into. Don't go in this alone. Would be my big message here. When we think about risk and managing risk, some things that you're going to want to think about are the staff, whether it's an EOR or an entity, is what does your organizational design look like? And that's where you can really leverage your subject matter expertise on the organization. Do you have a regional leadership model? What does that look like? Who is the leader on the ground locally? Do you need one? Perhaps it's a 1 or 2 person, setup. What do the reporting relationships look like? Integrating that with the organization and scaling for growth. Certainly, you're going to need a level of compliance expertise, whether it is an EOR or an entity setup. What does that look like? Um, you know, Usually organizations are not hiring an HR professional locally on the ground as a first step. There's a scale to growth and a point in which that makes sense. Do you leverage vendors and partners for that? When you think about specialization in those local policies, practices, payroll, taxes from a financial standpoint, you have to, what is the transfer pricing model? What is org design? Certainly, those things are implications that HR leaders need to be aware of and be driving that strategic process and advising the organization. What about data privacy and security? Certainly, that looks different, all over the globe, and where you may be perhaps looking to expand your organization. And so, really, there's a big learning curve here as an HR leader. Not, even regionally, not all countries, operate similarly. And so, having the right partners on the ground, consulting, whether it's locally or from a corporate setting, but looking at the different types of risk in your industry. And then you think about cultural implications. We talk about engagement, cohesion, integration into the organization. Depending on your org design, will foster, a sense of that, or keep your satellite offices more separately. And so it's important to understand what those fundamental infrastructure decisions and how those downstream effects affect your business, your organization long term as you look to scale, regardless of the entity setup that you choose. There's certainly implications for both. And you, as an HR leader, do have a very unique view of that for the organization and can leverage that and implement strategies, how to keep the organization, operating as one unit as you do look to expand globally. So with that, we will turn it over back to Sanjita to talk more about macroeconomic trends and expansion challenges.
Great. Thank you so much, Becky. This section will highlight the geopolitical and economic forces that shape global decisions around employment structures. But before we go into the details, we'll kick off this session with a polling question. That's great. So the polling responses that I see on the screen really aligns with what we see as a trend in the market. So if we zoom out for a moment and look at the global landscape, legal entity decisions are, of course, tax and HR logistics plays a big role, but aligning to the responses that we see as well, a lot of the decisions are made around reading the market, navigating through geopolitical shifts, and staying competitive in the rapidly changing world. So what we saw as a response from the audience is also aligned to the three key macroeconomic trends that we see influencing decisions on employment structures. So the first trend that we see is the remote work or dispersed workforce model. So we have seen a surge in the remote first models. So companies are hiring across borders before establishing infrastructure. And it's a great way to tap into the global talent, but it also raises serious compliance flags. The second trend that we see is geopolitical forces, so trade wars, protectionism, new local rules, and it's really shaping the way corporates want to expand, hire, and operate globally. And the third trend, and one of the most important trends, which we'll go into the details at a later stage, is the economic trend. So inflation, living costs, budget pressures. So that could directly impact your talent strategy and operational planning. So we have seen setting up a legal entity is no longer, or choosing an EOR is no longer just a checkbox exercise. It's a strategic response to global trends like remote work, shifting regulatory landscapes, economic pressures, and the evolving expectations of talent. But the legal and operational structure is just one piece of the puzzle. The other equally critical piece is your people strategy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Becky, who will walk us through how HR leaders are shaping future-ready talent strategies in the face of the macroeconomic forces. Becky?
Great, thank you. I think there's a few key things to think about from an HR perspective. And when you're looking at expanding globally, the first is just labor market shifts. Sanjita is talking about, the demographic shifts, expanding and contracting workforces in different regions of the world. Economic slowdowns, we're having to rethink compensation strategies and prioritize cost efficiency and hiring locally and globally. And so, how does this impact your plans in your global workforce? Is really these economic slowdowns. I would say the rise of remote work. We saw that as certainly a trend across this group is interested in the rise of remote work and distributed teams. Thinking about, pay equity across borders, legal compliance, and around culture and engagement, which is something, we've really spoken about. Tech disruptions, and automation. How is AI and technology affecting the skills in your company needs, and thinking about upskilling and reskilling. So HR's increasingly having to run scenarios and risk mitigation around these topics and kind of getting ahead of them when you think about kind of the macroeconomic environment. And so it's something that, you really, as an HR leader, is really increasingly becoming more a part of the discussion and wanting a seat at the table, the strategic table, is really making sure you're not just focused on the here and now and what's going on in the immediate need, but looking more broadly and more into the future around these topics and being able to develop strategies that work for your company. One of the questions in the chat was around culture and engagement strategies, and there's a lot of great things you can do, but it really making that specific to your organization. Sanjita and Alex really spoke about this, is what works for you now and in the future, and making sure those solutions you bring are aligned with your senior leadership team, understanding the needs of the board, what your executives want in the future. And so you're able to marry up those solutions to, it's really, I talk about a win-win. It needs to be a win-win for the business and also for the leadership team, and bringing them along that journey with you is very, very important. And so, at the beginning, we kind of talked about stakeholder alliances and getting key stakeholder information, and that process sort of continuing on throughout the entire journey is really going to benefit not only your organization, but certainly give you the insights you need to make the right decisions for the business. So with that, I will turn it over to Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from the employer of record side, no one wants times of geopolitical uncertainty or economic uncertainty. But that is part of just the globalized world that we live in. And so what we really see employer of record is offering businesses really focuses on three key words that I would throw out there. An employer of record will allow you flexibility, it will allow you reliability, it will offer reliability and also profitability. And why do I say kind of these three keystone words? So flexibility, from the vantage point of as global mobility changes and the market dynamics adjust, an employer of record allows you to have a very nimble and flexible footprint. So you're operating with a lower overhead, you're leveraging a third-party organizational infrastructure, which means that you can enter and exit markets much quicker than the alternative with an entity footprint yourself. This, of course, is going to allow you to adjust your workforce footprint very quickly and change as those market dynamics adjust and shift. From a reliability perspective, both Becky and Sangeeta touched on this, but we are expecting and have already experienced from COVID moving forward that employment regulations, tax regulations, trade policy is a constant evolution across border. And so being able to remain abreast of all of those nuances, regardless of where you're operating, can be overwhelming and can be very labor intensive. And so having a reliable partner that has expertise, boots on the ground from an HR perspective, from a legal perspective to help you navigate to ensure that you're operating compliantly would also be a benefit of using that structure where you aren't relying on your internal team within that, right, or responsible for the compliance, and certainly helping to navigate those complexities. You'll also, of course, receive kind of that navigation, that compliance expertise with, your tax advisors, your local legal teams, et cetera. And then from a profitability perspective, when we think about just optimizing for costs in your footprint, how do you manage costs, right? Really being able to scale your business wherever it needs to go, but really being able to make strategic decisions on where are you making longer term investments versus where are you testing markets and or have smaller footprints that don't necessitate the level of cost and complexity to be an internal burden on your tax teams, accounting teams, HR teams, legal teams, can certainly be a benefit as well when we think about an employer of record structure in comparison to an entity structure. Again, both are going to be relevant as you look at cross-border work. It's really what is the appropriate action based on the jurisdictions that you're looking to operate, the activities that you're looking to do in market, and what your short, mid, and long-term goals are within there. Sangeeta, I'd love to turn it to you on entity setup and long-term planning.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Becky and Alex, I think you have covered most of the key things and covered it very well. So I'll just bring the focus back to macroeconomics and how that plays a big role in terms of decision making around whether or not to set up legal entity. So coming back to the three economic trends that I talked about, and remote work and distributed workforce model, I think Alex touched upon it, Becky touched upon it, that continues to reshape the way the organizations think about their global presence. Pre-COVID, that was, a very rare discussion, but now you almost see that as one of the key discussions when global mobility is discussed across the table. So teams are more and more distributed, and companies are hiring talent across borders faster than even what their traditional infrastructure might allow. So this shift introduces both opportunity and complexity, mainly from tax obligation and employment law consideration, but also questions around long-term operational structure crops up because, with distributed models, companies are assessing whether or not they need entities in certain countries or certain regions. The key challenge, again, what Alex mentioned very briefly, is not whether a model is remote or on-site, but whether the underlying setup, whether it's an EOR or legal entity, can support the compliance, the employee-specific needs. So the employee might have nuances around their immigration, their tax position, their split family situation, whatever that may be, and also the business continuity over time. The next trend, which I briefly touched upon, is the trade wars, protectionism, and regulatory shifts, which is basically the geopolitical forces, is now one of the frontline concerns. So trade tensions, sanctions, foreign ownerships, and just the shifting immigration policies that we all hear about are actively influencing where companies hire and how they structure their operations. So there has been some recent changes that have accelerated the need for local employment models. For example, the data protection laws that has been introduced in Europe and Asia, or the new work permit regimes in Gulf. These are forcing companies to reevaluate strategies. So whether it's through establishing local entities or EOR arrangement, companies are required to navigate an increasingly fragmented regulatory landscape. And then the last trend, which I mentioned, I'm going to dive a bit deeper, is the economic trends. So the inflation, living costs, budget pressures has a massive impact on whether or not a company would want to set up a permanent establishment or an entity in a country. So global expansion, therefore, is highly impacted by the current economic situation. So the cost of living spikes, the wage pressures, the interest rate hikes are influencing not only where companies hire, but how they compensate and retain talents. So organizations are responding with a more localized compensation frameworks, hybrid remote models to reduce overhead costs, and even sometimes a phased entry strategy that could delay a full entity setup until stability. So in parallel, there is another big factor, which is the labor market that is fragmenting. So there we see a rise of the freelance ecosystems or the government incentives for local employment that's reshaping workforce planning. So the challenge now is balancing speed to market with sustainable, cost-effective talent strategy, which is also flexible for companies. And in response to all these factors, we see many organizations adopting a hybrid and a phased approach, which is basically testing the market with EORs, then scaling or formalizing operations based on validated demands, risk tolerance, and regulatory feedback. So in today's environment, like I see most of the times when I discuss with the clients, entity setup and EOR models are almost a part of the larger toolkit discussions around global mobility, and each with a role to play depending on the context, goals, and market conditions. But as I mentioned, the structure alone is not enough. The success of any global mobility or global model decision really relies on how we enable the people within it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Becky, who will walk us through how HR leaders are shaping workforce agility in the face of this evolving macroeconomic forces.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think we are just about to close and end our time today. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed hearing what both you, Sanjita, and Alex have to say. I think it really brings the conversation to a more strategic level and opens the door to really think about, as an HR leader, being the best business partner we can. And so, when we think about kind of what's next. Certainly we could have, I feel like we could stay on here all afternoon and discuss these topics. I love seeing some of the questions, loved seeing those. So if you're interested in continuing the conversation, we do have an Engage platform set up immediately following this. And also the Leadership Collective has set up 3 roundtable opportunities where you'll have the opportunity to speak with us and, HRCI, the Leadership Collective, further about these topics. I think I mentioned don't go in this alone. And part of the success of a HR leader is finding the right partners, finding the networks, getting the right resources to help you, regardless of the region, the country, the setup that you're looking at. You certainly, it would be impossible to be a subject matter expert in all things related to global expansion, and that's where your partners really come in handy. And so leveraging those. So I would encourage you to continue the conversation if this is something you're interested in. And Clarissa, I will go ahead and turn it back to you. I think we've got a lot of questions.
Excellent, Becky. Thank you so much, Becky, Sanjita, Alexandria, for a great presentation today. Really appreciate it. As I said earlier, we have HR professionals who get up early and stay up late to learn with us here at HRCI from all over the United States and certainly from all over the world. I'd like to acknowledge some of those HR professionals from outside of the U.S. Today, we have colleagues calling in, connecting with us from India, Canada, Ukraine, Tanzania, Kenya, Bermuda, Ghana, Australia, England, Nigeria, Egypt, Turkey, Germany, Colombia, Haiti, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, the Bahamas, and Portugal. If I didn't mention your country, please go ahead and put it in the chat. So you're right, Becky, we have lots of great questions today. So let me get started with a question. I'm going to send this one over to Sanjita. Sanjita, this person says, we have employees in the U.S. who wish to be international nomads. Is the best option to make them 1099 contractors or pursue another avenue to continue to employ them?
Yeah, so while I see the question, so while 1099 contracting might seem like a quick fix, it also creates significant compliance risk. So misclassification, tax exposure, permanent establishment concerns are kind of the key ones. And Alex, you can vet on that. A more stable option is to assess their destination countries and find out a more compliant structure, whether it's an EOR or formalizing the remote work guardrails. That's, again, one of the areas that companies work towards through your existing entities or partners. So we have seen companies implement remote work guard framework that blend compliance with flexibility. Alex, anything else to add on that?
No, I think it's a great lead in, Sanjita. The things to consider as well is many remote workers think that they can just go on a tourist visa, and technically speaking, that's not necessarily legal. And so to Sanjita's point, it's looking at where are they looking to go for what length of time, and what is the type of work that they're doing for your company that can trigger that. So, certainly there's some, I think Sanjita mentioned some great options of looking at how, maybe you allow folks to go for a specific subset of jurisdictions for a 30-day period. Looking at if someone has, is from another location where they want to go home and work, where they are authorized to work there. Also really interesting that's come up post-COVID is the locations that offer digital nomad visas, and looking that as a potential area to investigate. But I think most important is make sure you're tracking. There's a difference between someone going for 1 or 2 weeks versus 90 plus days. Each market is going to be slightly different.
Alexandria, let's just continue with your comments. This person wants to know, is there a rule of thumb in determining at what headcount number does it make financial sense to move from an EOR to establishing an entity?
Yeah, so I love this question. I think an important An important note I just want to talk about is an employer of record in its most effective capacity is leveraged across a global strategy. I think this question is asking more specific to one country, which I do want to address. But when you think about what are my options around my corporate footprint, our growth cycle, and where we're going, it can be, you can use an employer of record for different strategies, whether that is distributed workforce, so finding very technical talent in a local market versus entering a different market for new market expansion or sales growth. And so that ultimately, I think, just to ground the stage, is how can I leverage an employer of record to move into a market for either a short, medium, or long term based on what I'm doing there. Financially, it really is going to come to, and Sanjita touched on this, of what is your long-term goal within the specific jurisdiction that you are looking to operate in. When you look at entity setup timelines and costs, as well as ongoing maintenance costs, those are going to vary. On average, you're looking at an entity setup cost around 3 to 6 months. And then, of course, you have the ongoing maintenance components that are going to apply. When we look at, for example, we actually had an executive who was formerly an executive at a publicly traded company who tells a story of how he shut down an entity in Romania because he didn't know that there was another option. And while Romania was an amazing market for them to sell in, it was never going to be the same ARR generating location as Germany, the United Kingdom, and the US, because it's just a smaller market. And so here's an example where it's a peripheral market that at the time just was not revenue generating enough to justify the complexity of actually maintaining the entity infrastructure. And this individual would be the first to say, if I had known that I could have retained the talent, but reduced my complexity of my global footprint, I would have done so. So that's, I think, an example where the operation itself and the intention of the market may be valuable, but not valuable enough to justify an entity where you'd see a longer term strategy apply.
I appreciate that response. It ties nicely into another question, talking about strategy. And Becky, I'm going to direct this one to you. You mentioned HR role in strategic decision-making. How can HR leaders position themselves to influence early-stage global expansion conversations with the C-suite?
Great. Thank you, Clarissa. The number one way is to have a seat at the table. You may or may not have that now. And so expressing an interest and a desire and wanting to learn more. Maybe you're not invited to all the meetings, so meet with the key stakeholders later. Use your influencing skills to let people know that you can help. You can help facilitate. You have solutions. You have it. Perhaps you have some experience or you have some resources, and that this is something you believe you can be a part of to make successful. A lot of times the conversations center around the financial. I mean, that's the bottom line. Legal, finance, risk, those kinds of topics. And so, that's just the people side. That might just be the fluffy side. And so demonstrating your acumen around, wait a second, I can contribute to those things too. I have some particular expertise around those types of topics, and is one reason why today we wanted to focus around those are the things that the C-level cares about, right? And so HR needs to demonstrate an acumen and kind of get outside maybe just recruiting or a culture type activity or some of those events, and really tap into kind of tick up to that next level of being a partner around finance, around strategy, around the topics we're talking about today. I think HR can have a big influence, or whether it's an entity setup or an EOR. And honestly, that decision, one of the biggest functions that it affects is the HR team. And so having kind of, you know, a stake in it themselves, and as a HR leader, knowing, okay, what are the implications of each of these decisions, and kind of walking that out. And so I had mentioned, you know, getting in front of key stakeholders and really understanding the why and the needs of the business, and making sure you're a part of those discussions is super critical. I mean, that's the biggest thing, and not just recruiting, talent acquisition, that'll come later. So kind of putting that a little bit on the back burner, that sometimes HR wants to focus on maybe some of those people related stuff that will come, but really focusing on what's the strategy initially, and understanding the commercials of it and the financials is going to be sort of your key to the entry point, because then you can design a strategy that fits right in and that meets those commercial needs.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.